Hey guys, I just want to do a little bit of a quick update to the Cipher thing that I'm currently working on. I made a little bit of a mistake in the last video, which is basically focusing on these columns here. I've not been looking at this cipher for very long, to be fair, only for the past couple of days or so. Oh, no, that one. I can't select that one now. But yeah, I've basically realised why there's a pattern that goes down on those there anyway. The reason is, if you look at, obviously, this is the key, the original key that we get given. It gets grouped up into sections of 3 if you look at the original ciphertext. And obviously we know that these are going to end up being put at the very beginning of whatever it is. So we know that these here, it may be AR, AF even, or it may be FA. We're unsure as to what that would be, but we know that these are obviously going to come at the front, and that these two are going to come after, which is why we get these here with FA in it and AF in it. Because there's two possibilities: the F could come first, or the A could come first, but these two definitely come before these four. So that's obviously why they're there, and then again that's why they're there, because they're all in groups of 3. So there's a group of 3, there's a group of 3. So obviously this FF is going to come before, this GF is going to come before, but again it could be FG or it could be GF that comes first, we're unsure. So that's why there's two sets, because effectively we don't know if the F comes first or the A comes first, but we know that these come before these two, which is why there's this pattern going on here. So I figured that out. Granted, you know, there's probably people out there that figured this out a long time ago, but to be quite honest, I've not really looked at this cipher in a good couple of years or so, and even then I was just looking at what's been currently found at that point in time and things. So that's something that I've got out of the way anyway. The next thing that has basically been figured out is that there's a pattern here of GF, FD, GF. And funnily enough, it then goes GF, FD, GF. And this one here is the same as this one here, and so on and so forth. And the fact is, all of these are identical. Now, what that effectively means is whatever is here is here. It's guaranteed whatever is in this column is in that column. And whatever's in this one is in that one. And whatever's in this one is in that one. That doesn't change no matter where you look. Even if you look here, look, it goes 1, 2, 3, and then repeats itself 1, 2, 3. I mean, obviously after that and before that is different, but still. We have a repeating pattern no matter what possible keyword we use. This pattern is always the same. These 6 letters are always going to be in that order. So that effectively means that it could be, for instance, THE, THE, or it could be SAM, SAM, but it's always going to be the 3 letters next to each other. Which is pretty handy to know, because effectively if we find out what these 3 are, we're going to know what they are. Or even if we find out what that is, we figure out what that is. So it's a bit of useful information there. The next thing I've obviously done is I've got all the different possibilities there, and I've counted them up. This is in the top one, which is if the, I believe, if the F is first, so if the last end is first, because then obviously we would have the D first and then the G second. And here, down here, would be if the G was first and the D was second. So this is all the counts of the top here, and this is all the counts of the bottom there. And there's something you've probably noticed, which is AD never gets used in either of them. AX never gets used, and DA never gets used, and also XA never gets used. In total, there's the counts of both of them added together as well. So that's pretty handy. So the next thing that I thought about was obviously the issue that we need is we need the key square. So I think everyone's pretty much come to the same conclusion, is we can't figure out the answer unless we have the key square. So I know there's a few people out there trying to generate the key square, and I was even trying to help generate the key square as well, because obviously if you have the key square, you have the answer, effectively, because there's only 48 different possibilities once you've got the key square. The issue is, though, there are billions, trillions, quadrillions, there's just a ridiculous number of key squares. So to generate every single one of them is near on impossible. I mean, it can be done, but it would take a hell of a long time. You would need loads of computers working on it all at once. And then even once you've done that, you then need to generate all 48 possibilities for every single one of the key squares in order to find out all the possibilities for every single key square, for every single decryption, for every single possible key string. Which is just, honestly, it's not even worth trying, in my opinion, I don't think, because even generating every single key square would take near on forever. Even if you had so many computers working on it, we could probably maybe get it done in a year, but then you've got to do every single decryption for every single key square, so you're looking at another 48 years on top. So, yeah, trying to generate every single key square is not going to work. So we need to narrow down the amount of key squares that we generate. So obviously I've been looking at patterns and things that work and make sense and things like that. So obviously we are looking for a way to narrow down the key square, and to do that we need to know some of the letters. Now, to figure out some of the letters in the key square, you can't just look at this and go, oh, this one must be that, this one must be that. But we can get an idea. Like I said, AD's never used, and these two are never used, and this one here is never used. So what does that tell us? Well, I was doing some research over on letter frequency and how often letters are done, like used and things like that. And if you notice, like Z, Q, X, and J have a really low chance of being used in words. Obviously Z being the most unlikely, then Q, then X and J, and E being the most likely to be used. So there's a high possibility that when we're looking at how often letters appear, that this here is not going to be an E, and they're not going to be an E, and they're not going to be. They're more than likely going to be one of these. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that, okay, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 that aren't being used. It doesn't then mean that it's going to be the bottom 4. I mean, it's a high chance, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the bottom 4. It could be that it's these 4, or it could be that it's these 2 and these 2, for instance. Because, you know, it could say Zoe and Joke, which would have the J and the K in there, but it doesn't have the Q and the X, or, you know. So we can't guarantee, but we can say it's more than likely that these 5, or these 4, for instance, are going to be somewhere down here. We can also say that, by looking at the key square, that these ones here, and this one here, for instance, these are really high up. Like, in every single key square, these are in the hundreds, and none of the others come close to 100. I mean, this is the next closest, which is 56. And when you're looking down here, these are in like 200s, and not another one even breaches 100. So there's a high possibility that we're going to be looking at some of these being these here. So we can't say for certain which ones are which. We can't just say, oh, okay, there's 256 here, so it must be E. We can't say that because it's not guaranteed. But what we can do is we can then start looking at other possible patterns. So, for instance, we have DG here. Now, DG is used 56 times in the first and 32 in the second. In total, 88. Because it's also used here as well. Now, DG is at the beginning of the whole thing. So it's going to be the first letter of a word. So, although it could be an E, because, you know, it's pretty well used, it's more than likely going to be something less. So, somewhere a little bit further down, an O, and I, and N, and S, H, something a little bit further down. But then I was looking at these, and we're looking at the probability of one letter following another letter. And for some reason it's randomly reloading. So basically, if we're looking at these, we can say for certain here that the probability of the first letter being Q and the second letter being U is 98.7%. If there is a letter Q in there somewhere, there's a 98.7% chance that the next letter is going to be a U. Obviously, unless the word ends in a Q, which I can't think of many that end in a Q, if I'm honest. I mean, you could probably Google some to prove me wrong, but I don't think many do end in a Q. So if a Q was in here, the next letter would most likely be a U. Well, given that, if this first one was a Q, we know that the next one is most likely going to be a U. If not, then there's a 0.77% chance it will be an A, and so on and so forth, with a chance of it not being any at all, like an L or a K or a J. It's just not possible for it to be that unless for some reason it's the end of a word and the beginning of another. So then what we do is, looking down here, we've got letters preceding another letter. So obviously if the first letter is an E, then the second letter is most likely going to be an X. So this helps us out a little bit as well. So there's our X. What precedes X? Normally it's an E. Using that, we can kind of link it with this as well. I had somewhere else as well. I think it's on the same page. Here we go. The frequency of it being the first letter of an English word. Now there's a high chance that the first letter is going to be a T, an A, an S, or a H. They're the highest four. So if this is the first word, there's a high possibility that it will be one of them. If not, it will most likely be one of these, and so on and so forth. It could potentially be anything. It could start off with a Z. It could say zone, you know. But the fact that it appears quite often, not majorly often, but quite often, makes me think that it's something that's pretty high up in this table, because it's the start of a word, and also pretty high up in this table. So it's most likely going to be an S or a H. Something along those lines. Something that matches up with both. So we've got T-A-S-H-W. We've got T-A-S-H. I wouldn't say it would be a T or an A, because it's not as frequent as these. So it's most likely going to be a little bit further down, which would probably be an S or a H or something. So if we were to say that that's an S, then we'd also say, well, that's an S, and that's probably an S, well, that's an S. These here are also an S. We're starting to build a probable answer. Not a definite answer, but a probable one. Now, obviously we have this section here as well, which loops itself. So I was looking at that using how often certain things appear. Now, GF appears a hell of a lot. A hell of a lot. So when we're looking at the how common it is for a letter to appear, we're looking at one of the top ones, I'd say. Somewhere probably around there, I'd say. Maybe even these top ones here. So I took T, because I thought, well, if it's repeating, maybe this is the, and then this is THE or something. Or maybe, you know, it just seems probable for it to be one of these higher ones. So I used T as an example, and I went over to, is it this page? I'm sure it's somewhere. It might be in the other book. Here we go. I went over here, and I was looking at the probabilities of all of the words preceding or being after the next letter. So I took T as a starter, so there's all our T's. And I said, okay, so what if the next letter is, what's the next likely letters? Well, the next likely letters for a T, if we scroll down here, you'll see the next likely letter is a H. And if it's not going to be a H, it's most likely going to be an E. If it's not, oh no, it's most likely going to be an O. And if it's not an O, it's most likely going to be an E. And if not like an E, then an I. Then if not an I, then an A. And if not an A, then an R. This is the most likely. It's not guaranteed, but the most likely. So I put the most likelies in, H's, O's. After that would be the E's, the I's, the A's. Then I was like, okay, so what's most likely going to follow a H? What's most likely going to follow an O? So I found them out, and then I found out them, and then I repeated them, because obviously we know that if this is going to be a T, and this is then H or an O or an A or whatever, and then this is the most likely afterwards, it then repeats itself. So looking over this, we've got THE, THE, THA, THA, THI, THI. So some of these, it obviously can't be, because it just doesn't make sense. I mean, they could be the end of a sentence, like that, or that maybe, or that, and that could be the beginning of something. But there's certain things like this, for instance, that it's just not going to be. So we know that it can't be that they are those letters, but it could be that it's those letters. So I started with the first one just to see where we could go with this. So THE, THE. So if it was THE, THE, where could we go with that? Well, I was looking at the next things that are in the list. So we've got THE, THE. Well, if this was a THE, for instance, and then this was THE, the following one would have to be an E. So, obviously, one of the possible outcomes would be that this is an E. There's also a possible, where is it? Just here, if that's THE and that's THE, then this would have to be a H. So again, I marked down that one of the possibilities would have to be a H. It's possible that that could be something, but I'm not too sure on that, to be quite honest. I mean, I'm not even sure it's THE, THE. It could be absolutely anything, but working with probability here, we can start trying to narrow down certain things so it makes more sense. So these are some of the possible combinations of the most likely things, but the most likely things are now starting to look more like words rather than just the randomized crap that you usually get, like this sheet, for instance, where nothing in there looks remotely like a word. So effectively what we can do now is using this sheet here, so we know exactly how often certain things appear and how often they don't. For instance, these don't appear at all. We can then try and use letter frequencies with how often a letter normally appears in sentences and how often words start with a certain letter. Also along with how often certain letters come after other letters and how often certain words come before other letters, in order to try and figure out something that might make sense. So for instance, looking down here, obviously this is going to be the first start of a word. We can turn around and we can say, okay, the letter frequency that something starts with an X is really low, so it's most likely not going to be an X. Then what we can say is, well, X is pretty low down and it appears quite a lot, then DG is most likely not X. DG is also most likely not any of these because it doesn't appear that often, and it's also most likely not any of these because obviously it doesn't appear that often. So we can start narrowing down what things aren't and what things most likely are. And then once we figure out what things aren't and what they most likely are, then we can start trying to piece together things in the middle with what they most likely could be based upon the other things that we know they definitely aren't or could be. So that's the next step, I reckon, to figuring out the Keysquare, is to generate Keysquares of things that it's more likely to be rather than things that it's not going to be, because there's no point generating a Keysquare where XA is an E, because if we generate a Keysquare where XA is an E, we're never going to have an E in the sentence, and that's really unlikely. The same goes with DA, AX, and AD. They're most likely not going to be E's, they're most likely not going to be T's or S's, they're most likely going to be something like an X or a Z. So we can start narrowing down the amount of Keysquares that we need to generate, because now we can quite safely say, well, these four aren't going to be E's, S's, T's, they're most likely going to be X's. So we've now filled up one space with a possible 4 items, and we've also said that they're definitely not a possible 4 items, which means we've now narrowed down the Keysquares by a hell of a lot. So I think that's the next thing that needs working on, ideally, is making possible Keysquares that are most likely rather than every single Keysquare. How we go about doing that, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, I have pretty much all the data I should need, like how often each pair appears within the 48 different combinations. I also have, over in the other booklet, the likelihood that one character will come after another character, so the likelihood that Z will come after B is really low, or the likelihood that E comes after R is quite high, and that E comes after H is the highest by far. So I have all the data, and even on these pages I have quite a lot of data. It's now just putting together a program that takes that data to generate the most likely square. That's going to be the complicated bit. That's going to be the bit where it's going to have to do checks, and it's going to say, okay, well, what if it's like the first letter is a T, so what if the first letter in this is a T? Does that match up with the fact that what we have here is, if the first letter is T, which is DG, is that likely? And it's going to go, possibly, but then it's going to go, it's more than likely not, so it'll go down to the next one and then go, well, what about this? And it'll try and assign things based upon how relative they show up in the key strings, and also how relative they are just generally with the data that I have. It's going to be difficult, and it might not even work, but I think that's a better shot than trying to generate every single key square. So that's the update as to what I have at the moment. I have no working program that does any of this at the moment. It's just theory based at the moment, but I think if we put our heads together and like try and figure out a way of doing it, that's probably going to be the best way of coming to a solution. So there's your update, guys. Hopefully it's been useful and informative, and I'll keep you posted as to the other stuff that I managed to figure out. Catch you later.